know? What do you know? What do you know about that? How do you like that, sailor? Leave a place when you're a kid, maybe 17, 18 years ago, and you forget all about it, and all of a sudden you're driving along and smack-o, your own hometown up and hits you right in the face.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. I'm joined by Nadim Yared, the president and CEO of CVRx, which is a neuromodulation device approved in heart failure. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So Nadim, you've worked at GE, Medtronic in a senior executive capacity. So you know much about medtech and I think even X-ray as well. Based on your experience, how did you cross over to the neuromodulation, specifically as it pertains to treating, heart failures?
Yeah, so when I was at Medtronic, I ran one of their, I would say, best divisions in there. It was one of the best kept secret in Medtronic. It's a division that developed GPS for the body, kind of. And I'm talking in the early 2000s. It allowed surgeons to implant devices very precisely inside the body using a GPS-like technology. And one of the product that was implanted with our technology was the deep brain stimulation devices for Parkinson's disease. So those are neurostimulation devices to treat the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. So that was my first foray into this fascinating field of using electricity to affect the nervous system. But also being at Medtronic, you cannot escape the history where Earl Bakken, back in 1949, created the company from a garage in Minneapolis to develop basically the pacemakers. And if you do, I don't know if you know the history, but by the 60s, you already had a pacemaker operating in a wooden box outside of the body. And that was the history. So this was also using electricity to treat cardiovascular conditions. So you put 1 + 1 = 2. Fast forward, I'm here at CVRx. How we're doing exactly this is using the brain to treat a cardiovascular condition or to treat the symptoms of cardiovascular condition. So I see this as a natural progression of my history. Even before Medtronic, when I was at General Electric in the X-ray, I was the product manager for the first flat panel X-ray imaging technology used in a cath lab. And those cath labs are basically big X-ray machines used by interventional cardiologists to be able to insert stents inside the heart or help physicians, electrophysiologists to insert the pacemaker lead inside the heart. So it's, looking backward, it's easier to connect the dots, like Steve Jobs would say. Looking forward, when I was at GE, would I have ever thought that I would be doing what I'm doing today? No way.
Thank you so much for helping us to stitch that kind of narrative together. Now, at CVRx, you guys are using essentially electrical signals to be able to actually modulate or control some of these cardiovascular therapies. You mentioned how some of the other therapies are done, such as catheters and stents and so forth. Talk about what's most common and how is your approach fundamentally different and how well is it being accepted into the marketplace?
Yeah, so when we think about device to treat a cardiovascular condition, we immediately think or believe that the device has to touch the heart, either directly or indirectly. So whether it's a stent in an artery or a pacemaker or a left ventricular assist device, all of those devices, they do touch the heart directly. What we do is different. We are using the brain to affect how the heart is working. And I may need here to do a little bit like a biology or system physiology 101 for a second, if you bear with me. Our body, particularly the brain, is wired in a way that it uses a lot of information, so a lot of sensors, if you want, inside our body to be able to accomplish what it wants to accomplish. For example, a set of sensors that we all use all day long, the eyes, photoreceptors. The retina of the eye are receptors that sense light. This light is converted into signals through the fiber optic nerve, the fiber nerve that gets, the optic nerve that gets to the brain, the information. Similarly, in the carotid artery, so this is the artery that allows the blood to go from the heart to the brain, there are sensors in the wall of the carotid artery called baroreceptors. Those sensors sense pressure. And the brain is monitoring our blood pressure every single beat of the heart. So when we're climbing up stairs or sitting down, wherever we do, the brain is doing its function to adjust all of the system in the body to allow us to stand up and sit while maintaining the pressure somehow constant. In the common jargon, we call this sometimes the fight or flight mechanism. That's the mechanism that allows us to rev up the systems in our body to have more oxygenation to the muscle to escape a danger. That's the same mechanism. It's all driven by the brain that we are trying to influence by electrically sending electricity to those baroreceptors in the carotid wall. So another way to understand this, think about a thermostat in the wall behind you. You can dial the temperature and change the temperature of the AC system. If the dial is broken, you can light a match and put the match near the thermostat. The heat from the match will trick the system to think that the temperature in the office is too high. It starts blowing cold air. It will cool you down further. See, you're lighting a match, you're cooling down the office. We're doing the same thing. We use electricity in the baroreceptors. We trick the brain. The brain thinks, oh, blood pressure is too high. Let me slow things down. So the brain sends orders to the heart to slow down, to the arteries to dilate, to the kidney to remove fluids from the bloodstream. All of this done by the brain. And that's exactly what we need to have happen to treat heart failure. And that's how we work.
And just to be very clear, is that this isn't, of course, going to correct or be therapeutic for every cardiovascular disease. There are specific types of application. Can you get into those specific applications, whether it's irregular beats, heart failure, and others, versus maybe things that really does in fact need surgical procedures?
Yeah, it's a very complicated field. The cardiac diseases in general. If you want to group them into some buckets, you would say one of the buckets is the plumbing of the heart. That's where, we use a spring-like device called a stent to open up the artery that feeds the muscles of the heart. So when a patient tells you, oh, I've got an infarct, I needed a stent, that's a plumbing issue in the heart. All right, so that's one family of issue. Another family of issues is the electricity in the heart. Sometimes the electricity in the heart is disrupted for many, many reasons, including maybe a prior myocardial infarct. This electricity will create irregular beats. Some of them could be fatal. Those arrhythmia can be treated with pacemakers, ICDs, or ablation devices. Then you've got heart failure, which is a whole different family of diseases, not only one single disease called heart failure. That's a chronic progressive disease where the heart in time starts becoming larger. The walls of the heart become thinner. The heart will start losing the ability to pump blood. That's why we call it heart failure. It's the pump failing in time. And when that happens, how do we know? Well, when the heart is not able to pump vigorously, the lungs will start filling with fluids. The legs start filling with fluid. So we see patients with heart failure having swollen legs. They cannot sleep horizontal because their lungs are filling with water. And sometimes the water fills their lungs so much that they cannot breathe. They are rushed into the hospital. We call this a congestive heart failure event. And in the background, the heart keeps deteriorating. Our device tried to slow down this deterioration, actually try to regress it, but definitely by alleviating the symptoms of heart failure, which is shortness of breath, not being able to walk, the swelling, and on and on and on. So yeah, it's a complicated question. Thank you for asking it. And for many of us, before we dive into cardiology, we think cardiology is about heart attacks. Well, yeah, that's one form of the disease. There are many other forms that are very different.
And when we talk about neuromodulation, there are different approaches: non-invasive, semi-invasive, and invasive, including implants. What are the approaches that you guys are taking? And then the follow-up question to that is, if you could talk about clinical studies as well as peer review reports.
Fantastic question. So when we talk about neuromodulation and neurostimulation, those are two different concepts. Think about them as two overlapping circles. Neuromodulation is much broader than neurostimulation. Neurostimulation is when you are using an electrical signal to directly stimulate a nerve. For example, vagal nerve stimulation to treat epilepsy. That's a common product that exists today, right? This is an electrical wire that is wrapped around the vagus nerve, and we're sending electricity directly to the nerve, and then we're affecting something in the body. The nervous cells could be a nerve itself, or a spinal cord, which is a bundle of nerves, or even in the brain cells like deep brain stimulation, the SDN, for example. Neuromodulation is a broader field that includes neurostimulation, but you do not need to stimulate directly the nerve to provoke a change in the nervous traffic. For example, we can use ablation. We burn a tissue. The pain from this burn is a modulation of the nerve, because the pain is a signal that goes through the nerve started by burning your finger. So I can neuromodulate you by asking you to put your hand in freezing water. Your blood pressure will go up when you put your hand in freezing water. That's neuromodulation. All right. So neuromodulation is broader. What we do at CVRx, we do a form of neuromodulation called receptor activation. We're taking receptors in the body and we're stimulating them. Now, receptors are different than neurons, right? Like the retina is not a nerve, it's connected to the nerve. But at the end of the day, when we stimulate the retina or we stimulate the baroreceptors, we are changing the nature of the signals that are trafficking in the nerve. So we call it neuromodulation. And of course, neuromodulation could be done in so many ways. You can have it by having a device external to the body, a wearable device. Let me give you an example of a nerve stimulation or modulation, a TENS device. Or you've probably seen this used either by pregnant women or sailors, a watch that you wear on your wrist that sends signals to reduce the motion sickness. Okay, so all of that ticking in here is just disrupting the nerve traffic to stop the nausea effect of motion sickness. Those are external devices. You can have external device in the ear, a collar around the neck, in the body. You have TENS that you can wear as a belt outside the body. And then that's on the least invasive part. On the most invasive part, you have the product I mentioned earlier, the deep brain stimulation for the treatment of Parkinson, where we are digging a hole inside the skull to insert a wire deep inside the brain and keep that wire inside the brain forever, right? That's among the most invasive procedure that you can do, right? You're going deep inside the brain. And you have now, between those two extremes, you have a lot of variation. Again, sorry about being a very long answer in here to your question.
No, I feel like it still needs to probably be a little bit more elaborated in the sense of, so based on the neuromodulation, the approach is affecting the receptor. So can you talk specifically about the device in terms of where and how it's doing it? And then ultimately the effectiveness based on peer reviews and clinical studies.
Yeah, so our intellectual property, of course, is broader than the current embodiment of our device. The device we have right now is on its second generation. And the way we designed this second generation device is we have a pacemaker-like pulse generator. We call this IPG, implantable pulse generator. This is inserted in a pocket under the skin in the chest. And then there is an electrical wire, we call it a lead, that is connected to a tip of the wire that's called an electrode, and that electrode then is sutured outside of the carotid artery. So our system is, I would say, in the medium to low invasiveness on the invasiveness scale I described below. It goes entirely under the skin, our device. So we have to do some incisions to insert it under the skin and then close it, right? So it has to be done in a hospital or an ambulatory surgery center. But our device does not go inside the bloodstream or inside the brain or inside the heart. It's just under the skin, but not inside the structure. So the invasiveness question, we would say we're medium to medium low, as compared with a deep brain stimulation that will be a high invasiveness.
And can you talk about the clinical studies and peer review reports?
Absolutely. We to receive the FDA approval for our product, the pathway is called a PMA, a pre-market approval. This is the highest hurdle to get an FDA approval. Why most active implantable devices are required to be approved under this very heavy process called the PMA. We had to conduct 3 separate clinical trials. First in man phase. It was a single arm trial, and this was published in 2012. Then we ran a randomized control trial, both in the US and in Germany, Italy, and France. This phase 2 randomized control trial is called the hypothesis generating trial. We randomized about actually 146 patients into 2 groups. So patients will enroll in the study, and they will, they could either get the device or not get the device. And we follow them for a year, and we publish this data in actually 3 journals, peer-reviewed manuscript. When you ask me why is published in 3, well, the first one, we publish all results, and then we start looking deeper into the results to extract more information. And then we find something of scientific relevance, and then we submit this to another peer-reviewed journal, and they review it and they publish it. And this hypothesis generating phase 2 trial was completed in 2014. The data was published in 2015. Then we designed our phase 3, which would be the pivotal trial. That will be the ultimate demonstration of safety and effectiveness. We randomized more than 400 subjects in the United States. And we finalized the data of this trial in April of 2019. And when we submitted to FDA, the data was actually published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, JACC. In cardiology, this is one of the top 2 journals, basically, between this and circulation. They're, competing with the number 1. But for medical device therapy, from my perspective, JACC is the most prestigious cardiology journal to be seen. And our data was then reviewed by a panel of peers and was published in this journal. Our product also received the FDA approval and more recently reimbursement from CMS, so Medicare, to allow patients now to have access to this therapy. So it has been about a 10-year journey. This second generation device was designed in 2010. We started doing the first human with them in February 2011. And here we are almost a decade later to get the product approved and reimbursed.
Yeah, I think that's a real challenge with medtech, especially the kinds that has to be implanted. And certainly as an investor, these are some of the concerns and risk mitigation that has to be addressed. And by the way, congratulations on the milestones and what you've achieved so far. In terms of the therapies that you guys are providing, in terms of the results as well as other research, does it work best in a kind of a collaborative co-therapy with either pharmaceutical as well as other therapies in conjunction? Or is it sufficient enough that it can stand on its own?
Fantastic question. Our current labeling from FDA and the current trials that we have done that led to the labeling were all conducted assuming that the patient has already received the optimal medical management available. What I mean by this is a cocktail of drugs. Usually for heart failure, this cocktail of drug consists of at least 1 beta blocker, 1 ACE or ARB or the Entresto and ARNI class, and 1 diuretic at least, with a maximum tolerated doses. So our therapy is not a first in line. A patient has to go through the medical management first. And if they're still suffering from heart failure, that's when we come into play. And we do not recommend to reduce the medication once our device is implanted in the subject. Obviously, this will be the decision of the patients and their physicians to do what's best for the patient. But our recommendation is to maintain the patient on the background medical management therapy and add our device on top of all of that.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Can you talk about some of the kind of nuances? I think generally medical devices have gone very good in terms of low energy usage, long battery life, for instance. But what about signal interference and so forth? Can you talk about, how often do these have to be replaced? And there are other issues that has to be taken into consideration in terms of any type of electromagnetic, interference and so forth.
Yes. So I wish my iPhone has the same battery longevity that our device has. Our device runs 24 hours a day. It beats every single second of the day, and it beats about 16 times per second. And it sends electricity high enough to be able to activate those receptors and send neurochemicals to the brain. And it lasts about 5.5 years in average. So it's a tremendous amount of energy that we're submitting, but it's just a single battery. Now, the downside of all of this is cost. Number one, those batteries technologies are very expensive, and number two, it's a primary cell, non-rechargeable, which means after 5 years the patient has to go back to the clinic, and it's about a 15-minute procedure to open up these suture points under local anesthetic, remove the old device, put the new device in. Now, there is an advantage for the patient of doing this. Usually the new device often has some better features than the previous device, but it's still, I would say a minor inconvenience for the patients to have to go to the hospital and do this. And there could be some risks always associated. Anytime a patient goes to the hospital, there's always, the inherent background risk in there. So our goal right now is to try to get this maybe to closer to 6 years, but beyond that, it becomes unrealistic and unreasonable. And then they enters the question of other obsolescence that enter into the game more so than just the battery longevity. So the sweet spot for implantable medical devices have been in the 5 to 7 years for the primary cell, so single charge. There could be a possibility of developing a rechargeable device. And there are pros and cons to rechargeable devices. Obviously, the pro is the device could last 8 or 9 years before you have to replace it anyway, because even a rechargeable cell like the phone, after a year or 2 years of full utilization, the battery capacity starts going down. The biggest problem for our patients right now is the compliance. There are some diseases where the compliance with medication has been low. Heart failure is one of them. So hypertension, heart failure, and others. When the patient is not compliant with their medications, how can we ensure that the patient will be compliant with their recharging of their device? And that's a big question mark. So by making the device a primary cell, we're shifting that compliance responsibility from the patient to the physician. That means once the physicians program the device, the patient doesn't have to do anything for the next 5 years. They can shower, they can swim, they can do whatever they want, except they cannot hold a gun on the device when shooting. So if they're hunters, make sure you put the device on the other shoulder. But other than this, they can do everything they want. In terms of interferences, MRI is a big issue. And there are 2 levels of MRI interference, or at least in the regulations, we label them differently. There is the MRI safety, and there is the MRI compatibility. So first and foremost, we want to ensure that the patient is safe when they undergo inside an MRI. And that has a special labeling with FDA. The second level, which is even more complicated, is to allow the MRI to operate on that patient without too much interference in the image quality, right? And different devices go through these regulations step by step. In Europe, our device has received the MRI compatibility label under certain limitations. In the United States, we have not. So right now in the United States, we tell patients and physicians that our device is not compatible with an MRI.
So I guess my last question really is, you've been in this general field for many, many decades, even prior to the startup, like what we started with in terms of the narrative and the history that you laid out. Is in terms of kind of lessons learned to share. It's therapies are just hard enough, but when you take into consideration implantables and medical devices and the FDA hurdles and the costs, just a lot of big risks and issues. Can you look back, and is there one in particular that you can share and how you guys have overcome it and the lessons learned from there?
Oh yeah, we had our shares of obstacles over the years. Our company has raised about $400 million to get to the stage. So, pun intended in here, it's not for the faint of heart to do something like this. When it takes multiple decades, hundreds of millions of dollars of investment, and then you're still looking at, all right, so even after all of this, when will we become profitable, right? But the valuation comes often hand in hand with this. You're seeing right now in the medtech industry how nice the valuation of medical startups are in relationship to their revenue, because once they're on a momentum, it's very hard to slow them down. Barriers to entry are very high, and they're protected for a few years. And particularly when we have down cycles where the consumers maybe cannot afford, comfort product, medical products are always been needed. So the cycles are pretty stable year over year for medical devices. That said, I mentioned earlier that our company had its shares of problem. Let me share one in particular with the audience in here. In 2018, when we had the first unblinding of the data from our pivotal trial, we thought we did everything by the book. We did a phase 1 study. The data is great. We did phase 2. We had the data. We have the patient population. We started the phase 3. We did the first unblinding. And lo and behold, all of the data except one indicator, everything else was good. This one indicator was neutral, like nothing. And we started scratching our head, like, what is going on in here? All of the data we have from previous trial, this specific indicator, the NT-proBNP, was going very well, improving in the patients. So we immediately first, of course, alerted our board of directors, our investors. We alerted FDA, and with FDA, we developed immediately a communication plan to alert patients and physicians in the trial. This is what's going on. And some of us thought this is the end of the road. And FDA came to us and says, don't even think about stopping right now. You've gone all the way to here. Every single product goes through some form of question marks along the way. And we sit down, we reflect, we make changes, and then we solve them. So under the encouragement of FDA, we sat down with them and we put our best team, and they put their best team on this problem. And we immediately found out what the issue in the trial design was, which is we were actually too high in a specific patient population that should not have not been addressed by our product at this stage. Those are patients with a very elevated NT-proBNP. So we fine-tuned the program. We articulated a new set of hypotheses. We went back, enrolled patients, waited enough, get the data to confirm this hypothesis, and it was the right one. It was a huge success. So we went from almost dying in October of 2018 to surviving.
Well, on that note, I have been joined by Nadim Yared, who is the CEO of CVRx. Thank you for joining today. If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.